For those on the line, we will be beginning our webinar in 2 minutes. For those of you who are on the line now, we will begin our webinar in 1 minute. Good morning. Welcome to today's state budget presentation. My name is Holly, and I'm here behind the scenes to manage your webinar and to provide you an overview of a few of our GoToMeeting features. Your GoToWebinar control panel is on the right side of your screen. By clicking the orange arrow on the Grab tab, you can open and close the panel. To move the control panel, click and hold your left mouse button and drag. If you're looking to view the presentation in full screen, simply click the blue screen icon in the Grab tab. Audio. The audio pane includes all audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. Click Audio Setup to select your computer speakers and headset devices. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting Use Telephone, and the dial-in information will be displayed, including your audio pin. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions. Please type your questions or raise your hand in the Questions pane. At the end of the program, we will also provide you the email addresses of our presenters so that you may email your questions directly to them. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Bob Zarillo, Policy Analyst for the New York State Public Transit Association.
Thanks, Holly, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our State Transit Funding Update. I'm pleased to present this morning with Ron Epstein, Chief Financial Officer for the New York State Department of Transportation. Before I begin, I want to thank everyone on today's call for your support and advocacy efforts over the past few months of budget negotiations here in Albany. Every phone call, letter, trip to Albany, response to surveys, testimony, and public and private opportunity you took to support transit made a difference. Thank you all for your time and effort. I want to especially thank our President, Carm Vasile, for his tireless work on behalf of NYPTA, Bob Reed and Patrick Bambrick for all their efforts for the association, and Kathy Vandeloo and the ADG staff for a successful Transit Awareness Day and all their hard work every day for NYPTA. So now let's start. First, I will briefly summarize the transit funding in the state 2013-14 budget. Ron will then talk about some of the longer-term issues and DOT's implementation of the budget. State fiscal year 2013 transit funding includes the STOA program, transit capital funding, and budget legislation that impacts transit. And I'll conclude touching on some longer-term funding issues. Next slide, please. Final STOA funding for state fiscal year 2013-14 is unchanged from the governor's executive budget. There is a 7.23% increase statewide in STOA, appropriating available revenues to both downstate and upstate. The budget fulfills the state's commitments to the MTA's operating and capital programs. It provides a 9.16% growth in STOA for downstate systems other than the MTA. There's no growth for upstate transit systems due to flat revenues flowing into the upstate account. Those are the petroleum business tax and the transmission tax. Budget legislation extends the statewide allocation of the transmission tax for 5 years. Next slide, please. Transit capital funding in the budget includes an $18.5 million appropriation for the state 10% matching share to federal aid. It includes an $18.5 million SDF appropriation for non-MTA systems capital, similar to past years. There's a new $5 million appropriation for non-MTA capital projects from the New York Works funding. This is the first year of a 2-year program, and an MOU between the governor and the legislature lists the funding allocation for 2013-14. And there's a commitment for $16 million in prior year SDF funding to be allocated by DOT within 45 days. The allocation was announced by the governor to all transit systems as part of the budget. The proposed $100 million multimodal competitive program was dropped from the budget. Ron will talk more about the new capital funding in a few minutes. One other legislative provision affecting transit, the requirement to retrofit diesel engines, was extended to December 2014. Next slide, please. So how did we do on our budget recommendations? NYPTA advocated to make the statewide transmission tax allocation permanent. The budget extends the tax till March 31st, 2018, a 5-year extension. We supported extending the MTA district corporate tax surcharge, which funds all downstate systems and would expire at the end of this year. The budget extends that tax to December 31st, 2018. We emphasized the release of the $18.5 million SDF capital appropriation. The legislature received a commitment letter from DOT to allocate $16 million in prior year funding within 45 days, and the governor announced the allocation to individual transit systems. We suggested that the New York Works selection criteria recognize transit benefits. Instead of a New York Works program, the new $5 million capital appropriation for transit was provided. Our other recommendation to address the upstate funding structure was beyond the state budget. Next slide, please. So there are longer-term actions needed beyond 2013-14. We need to find inflation-sensitive revenue sources for upstate. These would improve the financial predictability for better service and capital planning. Also, the budget MOU calls for development of the next 5-year multimodal capital program. Longer-term priorities for NYPTA should include working with the DOT, the governor, and the legislature to address the structural issue with the upstate account, and to develop and enact a multi-year statewide transit funding program for all transit systems. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Ron.
Good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, it is a good morning for NYPTA. I just want to kind of reinforce some of the points that Bob made. It started out with the legislative budget hearing this year. We heard from multiple members, including Member of Assembly Brennan and Senator Kennedy, other members who were attending the hearing. They all asked very specific and directed questions to the Commissioner regarding the state's support of public transportation. And that heightened interest in public transportation continued throughout the discussions at the budget negotiations table. So clearly, transit was on the forefront of discussions, at least at the transportation table this year, and I congratulate you on your efforts. Next slide, please. I want to reinforce again some of the things that Bob had mentioned. Bob mentioned that funding was flat for upstate, and that is correct. He mentioned that basically the appropriation was based on the available revenues. While this may not sound like much of a consolation to the upstate recipients of STOA, I do want to note that it took a heroic effort on the part of the administration just to maintain the appropriation levels in last year's funding package. And part of this reason is the principal issue of dedicated funding for the upstate account compared to the downstate account. Next slide, please. If you look at the downstate account, you'll see that pretty much less than 1% of total funding is from sources that are outside of the dedicated funds for transit, or as I referenced some of the slide here, discretionary. Upstate, however, 48% of the funds for public transportation are from dedicated sources. So the majority of the sources supporting upstate transit are coming from what I'll call funds that can be used for other purposes in the ebb and flow of the budget process. More than half the program is susceptible on a year-to-year basis to whether it be budget cuts or other purposes. So the question becomes, how do you get that 48% of dedicated sources to a much higher rate? And while downstate, benefits from a diversified portfolio, probably the most significant impact in terms of the dedicated sources is that while they're economically sensitive, some perform better when others are performing worse, so they kind of balance out. And the balance, I think, is one of the discussions we'll also want to have in terms of the upstate fund, especially since the petroleum business tax, the principal source for dedicated funding upstate, has essentially remained flat. And the only reason the upstate dedicated funding has increased has been the temporary redirection of the long lines tax. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight in the attached here that to the extent practical, we try and treat the upstate and downstate universe on a proportional basis. Recognizing the order of magnitude is different, you can see here that the upstate and downstate program, sans the MTA, tend to kind of grow in proportion to one another. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that the percent changes over year to year over the last 10 years, that kind of bears out. Some years upstate has done better than downstate, but as you balance out, there is some tie to the downstate transit systems. So I don't want to have anybody have the impression that somehow upstate is being punished. This is purely a revenue issue that needs to be addressed to solve the upstate funding problem. Next slide. Talking more generally about the DOT capital program, this year's budget is significant because it includes a 2-year transportation program. Probably one of the most important facts of the process is that it requires us to develop a 5-year capital program for the period of 2015 through 2020. And that's important because it begins to realign DOT's capital program on the same basis as the MTA's capital program. And for those who are familiar with how these operate, the modal programs, including funding for downstate suburban and upstate public transportation systems, are in DOT's capital program. So this kind of allows us to address transit together in the out years. The budget also provides a framework for a $7.1 billion 2-year program, as I mentioned. The MOU that accompanies the negotiated agreement on transportation, it lists out specific projects for highway and bridge in each of the 2 years. It also directs DOT to develop a list of highway and bridge candidates that can be accelerated into the period. And that's something that I think is open to interpretation and discussion. I don't see anything that would preclude a discussion of adding public transportation infrastructure projects to those lists. It is something that like I said, we will be required to submit a list of candidate projects to the legislative leaders for their consideration, but they could also bring projects to the table that they would like to see the department administer as well. As Bob mentioned, the $100 million discretionary program that was supposed to be administered by the Regional Economic Development Councils was not included in the final budget agreement. Those funds were reallocated. $75 million of the $100 million went to CHIPS, which is for local roads and bridges, and $25 million went to augment funding in the budget for the repair and replacement of transit, rail, and aviation infrastructure. Next slide, please. So getting to some more of the specifics, I already touched on the $155 million again, and like I said, I'm not sure that anything precludes the department or the legislature from bringing infrastructure projects to the table that either are modal in nature or that benefit modes. So I would, urge you to consider some discussion on that. The $75 million in CHIPS, as I discussed, is good for transit, and that also helps the local governments make improvements on the network that the local public transportation systems operate on a daily basis. The budget includes $10 million for aviation facilities above and beyond what was in the executive budget, bringing it to a total of $14 million. And the significance there is it's the first time since the end of the 2005 to 2009 Transportation Bond Act that there are capital infrastructure funds beyond what was required to meet the Federal Aviation Airport Improvement Program match requirements. So there will be some funding there for airports. The freight rail facility program essentially is doubled. There's $10 million that's provided out of the $25 million from that original $100 million that was for discretionary funds. $10 million of that goes to freight rail facilities, bringing the total to $20 million for freight projects in the current budget year. $3 million of that may be used by the Long Island Railroad to upgrade diesel train engines that are equipment that are leased by freight railroads from the Long Island Railroad. And again, there might be opportunities in that 10/20 million for rail facilities. Might be some projects that are developed and implemented that could also benefit the owners and operators of stations along the corridor. And as you know, in Syracuse and in Albany and also in the Hudson Valley, there are publicly owned stations that are owned by transportation authorities and municipal transit systems. Just turning our attention to the $5 million, as Bob mentioned, there's two distinct pots of transit capital funds that are being made available this year. There is $16 million in prior year funds and an additional $5 million in new funding for upstate and downstate suburban transit systems. The allocation of those funds were based on the historical needs that we had in place for approximately a 12-year average, and the governor had released those numbers just the other day. The department will be sending out very shortly an application form for those funds that were announced, as well as instructions in terms of how to fill out the application. We're looking for some very basic information, which includes a project description, a project budget, schedule, if you're using other state or federal funds, how these funds are being used in conjunction with this year's allocation. So you'll receive that very shortly. I do want to remind folks for the capital, 100% state capital program funding, it is a reimbursement program. The funds may not be used for substitution for the non-federal share of a federally aided capital project. Unlike the federal capital funds, administrative expenses are not eligible activities under this program. And of course, it goes without saying, but all applicable procurement rules in the state of New York have to be followed in terms of the acquisition of whatever assets are procured. So that actually concludes my remarks. I'm going to turn it over back to Bob.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Ron and I are happy to answer any of your questions now. Please use the question pane on your screen to raise your hand. Click the icon, the hand icon, and we will unmute you.
I see we have a question from Brett Brum. Brett, we are...
No question. Sorry.
Do you have a question, Brett?
No, I didn't have a question, no.
All right, thank you. We'll give a moment to see if anyone else has any questions. There is one question about whether or not there will be a copy of the PowerPoint available. We will be making a copy of this presentation available on our website later today. Are there any other questions? Just in case, we're going to unmute all lines for a moment. All right then. It appears as if there are no further questions. We thank you again for participating this morning. If you'd like to reach Ron or Bob via email, please use the email addresses at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Later today, this webinar will be posted to our website for anyone who would like a copy. The NYPTA staff looks forward to seeing you at future training programs. Thank you again for joining us. This ends our webinar presentation this morning.